Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Michael Kiwanuka called Love and Hate. So there's a term that's become somewhat popular on the online music critic scene, particularly on YouTube. Coined by one Todd Nathanson, otherwise known as Todd in the Shadows, it's one that's attracted a fair amount of attention, expansion, and detractors. One that I've even used myself. The white guy with acoustic guitar genre. It's a bit of a nebulous negative term because obviously not all white guys with acoustic guitars make bad music. Look at Mark Kozlik or James McMurtry. But it's typically used to describe a certain sort of gutless, edgeless, artless pretension that's perfect for scoring your average listless summer barbecue that wouldn't dare to threaten or challenge anybody. And given that most of this music tends to make my skin crawl, I have no problem whatsoever disparaging this type of music. Not just for the often below average songwriting and guitar work, but more for the attitudes beneath it. I elevate artists like Mark Kozlik and James McMurtry above the term because they're at least trying to make artistic statements. Whereas your stereotypical white guy with acoustic guitars, they make music in order to pick up chicks or put up a forefront of depth that really isn't there. But I'll also admit that it's something of a narrow term, and it's by no means limited to white guys, so what about black guys with acoustic guitars? Well, you're gonna find far fewer examples in this subgenre, but there are a few. Darius Rucker, former frontman of Hootie and the Blowfish, probably one of the whitest bands ever to exist, immediately springs to mind, and it's definitely a fair comparison. But when you would consider Michael Kiwanuka, I would definitely hesitate to assign the label, mostly because he seems to play in an entirely different ballpark. If even on the surface, some people might be inclined to use that label. For those of you who don't know, Michael Kiwanuka is a British singer-songwriter who got his start as a session player before his breakthrough in 2012 with his debut album Home Again, which definitely had its warm folk touches and a fair amount of acoustic guitar, but tended to play more towards old-school soul touches with the organ and a slightly rougher production. But at the same time, as much as I liked a lot of his delivery, the writing wasn't always stellar. And to be fair, good soul music doesn't always need brilliant lyrics, but it did feel a little thin at points. Enough that I could see why people might at first glance assign that label, or at least consider him a bit of a throwback. But he didn't seem willing to accept that, so recruiting Danger Mouse and fellow UK producer Inflow, he dropped his sophomore album Love and Hate that on the surface looked to be getting more conscious and develop more lyrical bite. So after I caught some strong singles, I figured I might as well dig into this. Was it worth it? Well, on some level, it definitely was worth the many listens I gave this album, but then again, the more I dug into it, the more I found myself frustrated that I didn't really like it more. For sure, it's an improvement over Home Again, but didn't quite tidy up enough of the areas that really did need attention. As a soul record, it definitely takes more chances and plays in darker territory, but I'm not always certain that it flatters Kiwanuka's strengths when that happens. Again, for sure it's very good, but I'm not quite sure this is a great record or worth the insane amount of critical acclaim it's received. It kind of would fit into the critic bait category. I can see why a lot of retro-leaning critics would love this album. So to find out why, let's start off with Kiwanuka himself. And yeah, a significant portion of this record's appeal lies in him as a performer, with a sort of liquid, smooth, yet very potent, organic performance that draws a lot of comparisons back to, say, Bill Withers. And for me, well, it's an interesting case, because while you could draw the parallels with Bill Withers or Billy Paul, Kiwanuka might be able to match their volume, but I don't get that raw, rougher edge that I found so compelling in their vocals. And sure, you could argue that's kind of the point. This record is a more reserved and vulnerable affair and isn't looking for heavy fire or brimstone, but I'm not sure that's always reflected in the instrumentation, production, and especially the backing vocals, which seem to be crying out for more fiery, explosive, borderline gospel delivery that doesn't really materialize. I mean, one of the most recognizable elements of this record is Kiwanuka's fuzzed out guitar line that sizzles through tracks like Cold Little Heart, and then showing up again on Place I Belong, the title track, I'll Never Love, and the closer that's dominated by the guitar, The Final Frame. Hell, you even get a fuzz on the sax line in One More Night. And make no mistake, I'm a huge fan of that, in terms of adding some distinctive bite and character to this album. But I wish Kiwanuka could support it a little bit more in his delivery, actually bring a little bit more presence there. Granted, that's not all his fault, mostly because the production choices feel a little bit all over the place too. And yes, this is where we're gonna have to talk about Brian Burton, aka Danger Mouse, yet again. Now, let me stress, I prefer his work here to when he was working with the Red Hot Chili Peppers earlier this year, whereas muted tones are just a poor fit for that band's loose fire and energy on the album The Getaway. Kiwanuka plays to it a lot better, especially in the sumptuous string sections that ebb in and out beautifully, and none of it feels stiff or mechanical either. There were some drum machines on I'll Never Love and One More Night, and you can barely tell, which allows the organic textures in the acoustic guitar, the real hand claps, and the backing vocals really burnish the rougher atmosphere. It's probably the biggest reason I don't find Cold Little Heart overly indulgent, for effectively starting with 5 minutes of instrumental that then later repeat with the vocals for the second half of the song. It's almost so gorgeous you don't care. And when this record plays more to this bombast, it excels. The smoky electric guitar and organ complete with the key change and falling, the huge swell of strings and organ on the solo of the title track, even if the backing vocals did grow a little bit stale by the end, and that low-key growth and razor-tight balance between frustrated anger and despondency on Black Man in the White World. And yeah, since it's a Brian Burton produced album, we also get the tonal and production choices that don't nearly work as well as they should, like on the compression piled over Rule the World until that song could open up a little bit more, or the backing gloss on the bridge of I'll Never Love, or the incredibly weedy guitar line on Father's Child. And that doesn't even touch on the one element of the composition that really did bug me. This record feels very underwritten and stretched, especially in its length and even for a soul album. Now don't get me wrong, I dug the guitar solos that added a little bit more meat to songs like The Final Frame, but tracks like Father's Child feel far too long for the thin instrumental and lyrical ideas that we get. And this record could have definitely benefited from more of the tightness and groove that we got on One More Night or Black Man in the White World. But by now, you've probably taken notice of that song title and want me to talk about the lyrics and themes. And like with Kiwanuka's last release, while I do think these songs tend to be a little bit underwritten, it's also more of a factor because they're also a little bit more abstract or make the framing a little bit more complicated. The one common consistent mood is depression, never feeling good enough and always sliding towards the presumption of failure, even when others might actually believe in you. And indeed, you give some of these lyrics to some emo bands, they could definitely fit. I'm not gonna lie and say that the self-pity on Cold Little Heart or Place I Belong treads right up to the line with me. I'll Never Love goes right over that line, and despite being one of the most succinct songs on this album, it is also one of the weakest, because it plays more to the tortured artist card to love them and then leave them, and it does not connect at all with me, doesn't really fit with the rest of the album. I got a lot more out of songs like Black Man in the White World, where he's so far past anger and grief at the systemic injustice that he's hit some sort of numbness and isolation, or the failed relationship in Falling that the girl tries to reignite and Kiwanuka seems powerless to stop her. No, it's not better than when Mariana's Trench did it with Wildfire, but very few songs are. But to me, the midsection of this album where he confronts his own isolationist depression on Place I Belong, followed by the drive to come back from it on the title track and One More Night, it's easily the strongest section of this record for me. Hell, Rule the World has the same sort of aspirations, all the while acknowledging that while he might need help to get there, he will have to be the one to make that choice to rise up and take it. And maybe that's why the ending of this album kind of hit a weird note for me. I appreciate the apology and desire to make things right with his girl, but the way it positions it all as inevitable, turning what was framed on Falling as tragic, just doesn't quite sit as well in terms of the context of the album, especially when you have lines like, "It's too late to run away." What? But you know what, in the end, this was a really hard album to evaluate because it really does do a lot right and it is a real improvement. The thematic core is richer, there's a lot underneath the surface, the instrumentation has a lot more bite, but at the same time, it's a flabbier album. This album could have been cut down and stood out as one of the best of the year, but as it is, while there are some truly great songs here, for me, it is an extremely strong 7 out of 10. And yes, I understand that will be controversial, and really, I was back and forth on this album for the past week, but let me stress that I am going to recommend it. Michael Kiwanuka has improved considerably with Love and Hate, and while I definitely think he's on the path to making something truly special, if you're more of a fan of old school soul, you're gonna love this album, so make sure, definitely check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I got the poll up here, so I can imagine what my particularly controversial score I gave here, it might be able to say, hey, I'm curious what you guys all thought. Because I can imagine me giving this a 7 out of 10 when everybody else has been loving this album, that might raise some eyebrows. But till then, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to give a listen to, I will try to fit them in. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.